Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Gilda Hilaire, and I'm the Senior Product Marketing Manager leading Marketing Cloud Trailblazer programs. Today, we're doing a deep dive into interactive email and interactive forms presented by Matt, who's Product Manager at Salesforce, and Manisha, who is the Senior Product Manager. We will also have a couple of Salesforce MVPs and marketing champions who will be monitoring the questions. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. We will try to address these during the presentation and at the end. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to Matt, who will be leading the session.
Great. Thanks so much, Gilda. So hello, everyone. I'm Matt Schmitter. As Gilda mentioned, I'm a product manager here at Salesforce. I actually came over with the Rebel acquisition. So Manisha and I both did. As a standalone company, Rebel was really focused on interactive email across the board. And so we'll talk about that today. We'll get into the Salesforce Marketing Cloud product, and as well as, just the benefits of really interactive email forms. But before we get started, please remember, make all purchasing decisions based on generally available products. So some of the things we touch on today may not be, most of them are. Thankfully, the email form block is, so we can talk a lot about that today. So our agenda for today, since I'm not sure exactly the background everyone has with interactive email, I'll spend just a few minutes doing a little bit about what is interactive email. We'll talk about what the forms look like, and then we'll talk about some best practices, and then we'll really get into the demo. I'll do a little bit of a demo, and then we'll talk a lot about data, how you can use the platform to take advantage of the data that you're getting from this product. And so yeah, let's jump in. Interactive email. So likely, especially over the past 2 years, and even this past year, I feel like we're getting more and more people talking about interactive email, and it's not always clear what they're actually referring to. So initially, when interactive email started out, you might have heard a lot of kinetic email, microsites or web and email, actionable email, and really including AMP for email. These are all words that mean you can take an action in the inbox that doesn't necessarily lead you out of the inbox. So interacting with an image carousel, hotspot, the form entry, all of those things that happen in the inbox. What it's not is dynamic email, dynamic content, personalized content, live content, open time, real time, personalization. Those kind of things are fantastic and we love them, but they're not really interactive email. So there's a lot of interactive email things that we can talk about. And as I mentioned, with Rebel, we focused on a lot of different things. But when we built this into the Marketing Cloud, what we really wanted to focus on first was our most valuable use case, and that was forms. And so the great thing about forms is they're widely known across the web. People are familiar with them. They understand how to interact with them. And so it's a familiar experience that can really drive engagement with your email campaigns. And so, as we brought these into the Marketing Cloud, what we wanted to think about was, what are we really trying to do? And we really, we wanted to make the inbox a surface for applications. And so with the form data that you're able to capture, the interactions you can have with this, it's a really powerful tool that can allow you to collect more customer data. And then you can use that data to drive personalization, boost engagement, and really just drive kind of whatever metrics that you're looking for. And how we can do that is we focus on a few use cases in particular. The first is progressive profiling. So this is, that welcome experience where you need, or perhaps some orphaned email addresses that you have that you want to fill out their profile. All you know is the email address. They may have made a purchase at some point. What can you find out about, their demographics, who they are, other indicators that you can use to help personalize your communications with them. Reviews and feedback. This is a one that we've seen a lot of success with some retail customers on product reviews. They're very important to the site to drive additional purchases, to drive that purchase behavior. People want to know, is this a good product? And so pulling this up into the email to allow people to provide that feedback is a really powerful tool to eliminate some of that friction and collect more of these reviews. It doesn't have to be just product reviews, though. You can also think of this in terms of NPS or CSAT, just anything where you need to, capture some feedback, get a rating, and then pull that data back in for use later. These next two cases are more related to Sales and Service Cloud. So, with a lead form, for instance, you can fill out details ahead of an interaction with a a salesperson or some kind of, in this example, we're thinking about like a personal shopping day, and you want to give that associate more details about what this person is actually looking for ahead of time. And so you can ask those questions, which then can, the data will be collected and can be fed back into your Sales Cloud to update that record so that the next person to come in and pull that data can look and see. And similarly, service forms, so Service Cloud. So think about kicking off a case after an interaction, or a follow-up communication based on something. So if we think about this example, if you can read the text as it flips through there, but really from that last personal shopping experience, we were sending a follow-up to say, hey, we know you had a trip coming up. Was there anything else that you'd like to know or that we can answer for you before you go? And then that can feed back into Service Cloud to empower that service associate, using that case detail to connect with that customer. So that's a quick look at email forms, and there's a lot of great resources that we put out there, and we'll share them out after this, that you can, if you need to dive into each or any of those topics, you definitely can. So let's quickly talk about some best practices as well. So the big thing is, with interactive email, like many new technologies, you should think about what you're doing. So does it make sense to make this email interactive? There are some scenarios where the answer might be no. And while that breaks my heart, that's okay. It's better to think about that customer's experience, the overall user experience, how this interacts with your brand and what you're trying to accomplish before you send out these campaigns and then realize that that wasn't such a good fit. So think about what you're asking the customer to do. Can it be done in email? Should it be done in email? Will it improve my results? And we'll talk about this a little bit more, but really thinking about what you want to measure and how you want to measure the success of the campaign is very important for these campaigns that don't just rely on clicks anymore. So once you've identified those campaigns and said, yes, this is what I want, these are some of the things to keep in mind when you're designing your interactive experience. So I said that forms are pretty well known across the web, but think about making sure that you maintain that simple, easy to use form that doesn't intimidate people. To make it something, if you have a form on their website that people are used to filling out, try to make it very similar to that, if not exactly the same. Be repetitive. So, don't be afraid to send these multiple times so that people get used to the idea that they can actually interact with this. And don't be afraid to call out the interactive elements. So adding a note like this, well, it kind of sounds funny as we talk about it here as we're thinking about a campaign, but it can really increase results, because we've spent the last 2 decades now almost tricking people into clicking on things that they thought would do something in their inbox, but they don't anymore, right? So the triangle on an image that you think will play a video, but then takes you to a different site, or the search bar where it looks like you can type something, but again, when you click on it, it takes you to the site. So we have to get ahead of this and make sure that people understand that they can actually take these actions and that we're not tricking them anymore, that it's okay to do this. And so you can do that by really, being very clear and explicit in what you'd like them to do. So unfortunately, there are some email clients that don't support interactivity. So what do you do with those? And there's really 2 options. You can provide no content. So what I would think about in this scenario is if you have a form that you're adding that isn't the key message in the email, it's some supplemental data that you'd like to collect, you may opt to not include a fallback experience. And what happens in that scenario is that if you open on an Outlook, for example, that doesn't support interactivity, that section just collapses. It's not there. The email message looks as it did before. Those recipients are none the wiser. But for someone who opens in a Gmail or an Apple, AOL, Yahoo, those experiences, they will see the form and they can take that action. For the image that we have here on this slide, this is a review email, kind of like we talked about before. This one would make sense definitely to have a static experience as your fallback. And likely, you may already have something. So in this case, as a retailer, I might be sending in an email that when you click that write a review button, it takes me to a landing page where I can do this. So I can pick that up, I can use it as the fallback, and then I'm providing the best experience for anyone who receives this. So once you've got those out there, you got to think about, how do I measure the effectiveness of these campaigns? Open rates are still great. That's not going to be impacted, but click rates could be impacted. So, generally what we're thinking about, before interactivity or before you've added an interactive email form, for instance, is you're measuring those clicks to see how many people have gone to the site to take this action. With an interactive email form, you're now saying people might not have to click out. So they could start filling out the form, decide that they don't really want to provide that, and you don't have the visibility into that, but you've got one less click now that email would have gotten before. So it's really important to think about the metrics that will drive campaign effectiveness, or that you can define as your success metrics. Number of submissions, or even more granular, the number of data points collected, the number of actual products reviewed. Those kind of things are a great thing to think about as you're measuring these campaigns. And then one of the things that we're going to talk about a lot more in a few minutes is the afterlife of the data. So being really thoughtful about using this data is the key to getting the most value out of an interactive email form. And the reason for that is, while the interactive email form is great, and it does remove this layer of friction, and it provides a lot of value to the customer and to us, the really important part of this is data. And so you've got to be mindful of the plan that you have for that data, so that it doesn't just go into a data extension and sit there, because that's not helping anyone. It doesn't help the customer that submitted it. It doesn't help you as a marketer. And so it's really important, and that's why I will harp on about it for a few more minutes after we get past the demo. So for those of you who haven't seen or aren't familiar with email form block yet, there's really three big pieces that make it work. The first is Content Builder. And I didn't mention this yet, but the email form block is available in Pro accounts and higher, and it will consume super messages. So if you have questions about that, reach out to your account team. They can fill you in all the details. But the three things that you need before sending an email form in your email is Content Builder. So we'll use a template where you'll drag and drop an email form block, and I'll show you through that. I'll walk you through that in the app in just a minute. And Cloud Pages. So this is a really important part, because this is actually where the submission will occur. So after someone fills out the form in the email, they click submit, they'll be taken to this Cloud Page. The right to the data extension will happen there. If you have required fields or other validations, it will happen on the Cloud Page. And then you'll be able to show success content, or decide what happens after we've received that, written to the data section, captured the data essentially. So my little call out there, don't forget to publish. It's an easy thing to overlook as you're getting so excited about setting up your first interactive email page. But it is the most important part of the Cloud Pages step. And then the third is the data extension. And so as you guys know, as users of Salesforce Marketing Cloud, data extensions are incredibly powerful. Once you have the data in there, you can do lots of things with it. And so that's where we're going to place our data. And so if you'd like, you can build a data extension before you start creating your email form block, or you can also do so within the block. It really just depends on your workflow, what you're comfortable with. And of course, if you decide to make one in the block, you can always edit it later outside of the block, those kind of things. So today what we'll look at is this welcome campaign for our Cumulus brand, which is a financial services company. They've got this great welcome campaign right now. It's got the big green update your preferences button that takes you to a landing page where people can fill out the form. So what they'd like to do is pull that form into the email. And that's what we'll do. We'll replace that button with this form that we'll look at now. Let me switch screens here. Stop and restart, because earlier it didn't like it. All right, so now it looks like you guys should be seeing the Marketing Cloud app, and I'm already in Content Builder. I'm going to actually jump over here to Cloud Pages, just in case you haven't seen this or haven't created the page yet. This is Cloud Pages within the Marketing Cloud. I'm in a collection, and then I have the opportunity to now create an interactive email page. And this is the type of page that will be picked up by the email form block. Once you're in the page, you'll notice three things. There's a section at the top. There's a middle section, which has a form block that will already be in it. And there's a section at the bottom. And so you can drag whatever blocks into whatever order that you'd like. But really important here, aside from publishing, is also to click into this form block, because this is where you'll define the type of content that's displayed after someone submits. So in this case, I've chosen a block from Content Builder. You could also choose no content or redirect to a URL. And we'll talk about that redirect option a little bit later on. So now if I bring us back into Content Builder, I'm already in this template. This is the button. I'm going to delete this. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag in my email form block. Put it in the wrong place, so let me move that. And then these are the starting points. So these are the use cases that I briefly spoke about in the beginning: review, progressive profile. And as I click on them, you'll see that we update with a preview. of each case form, lead form, but there's also an empty starting point. So if you know what you're going to build, it may make more sense to start here. And today that's the case for me. So I'm going to start with an empty starting point. And what we're going to see is the cloud page's destination and the response capture. So this is where we tie this form to a particular cloud page. And in this case, my interactive content collection, the welcome, thank you we just looked at, and a data extension. So I can use an existing data extension, or I can create one automatically. And so I'll go ahead and create one. I call it this. So great. So now I've just created a data extension. And now I can get into adding fields. So there's two types of fields. There are visible fields and hidden fields. Visible fields are those that the recipient will interact with, that will capture the information that you're asking them about. Hidden fields allow you to pass data behind the scenes. So that can be a subscriber key, a product key, an order number, a case number, kind of anything that you might need to tie this back later to a record or some other piece of data. That's what you can pass in the hidden field. So what I'll do is I'm going to start with a text input, and I'm just going to walk through a couple of these, and then we'll jump to a fully baked form in a second. Again, there's a lot of great resources that allow you to kind of dive deeper into these. So I don't want to take up too much time, but I do want to make sure that you're aware of just the high level on how the form block works. So I've provided my input label, and now I choose a data attribute, which is a field in the data extension. And as you'll notice, there's an ID field that's already here. And so when we auto create a data extension from the email form block, we add this by default. This is actually a primary key on this data extension. And the reason we do this is the behavior for the write to the data extension changes based on if you have a primary key or keys in your data extension or not. So if you do not include a primary key, then every submission will just add a new row to the data extension. If you do include a primary key, you then have the ability to either add another row or do an upsert based on an existing row. And so how that works is if I choose to use this ID, and at the end of this, I'll actually assign it to a hidden field and I'll tie subscriber key to it. And so in that scenario, every submission for that recipient will upsert into the existing record if it's there. If it's their first submission, it adds that record to the data extension. If you'd like to use primary keys and have a submission for each person, you can do that as well. You just need to use multiple primary keys. And what happens is if you leave the primary key blank, so in this example also, I could choose to leave the ID field off, we'll just generate a GUID for each submission, just a random character string that will be in there. So you'll still have a record for each submission. So there's a few ways to go about it. It gives you a lot of flexibility in how you want to manipulate the data or capture it coming in. But in this case, I need a new attribute because I don't have anything else. So I'm just going to do a first name field. I'm going to make it 150 characters long. I'm going to make it required. And this is where we're going to get into, some of those best practices that I mentioned. Let's do, a description. I'm going to add a placeholder. One quick note about the placeholder, it doesn't work in all email clients. So like Gmail, for instance, will not show the placeholder. So it's important that you do use the description and don't rely on just the placeholder to provide instructions to your recipients. But you can definitely use them in conjunction to provide a more powerful instruction set. So that's a text input, pretty easy. Most people are aware of that. And when I look at this list of inputs, there's a few that I really like. The button, single and multiple choice. So these are really clickable on mobile. They're great for collecting preferences. And then the image, also great. I'm going to actually go ahead and add one of these in here, and we're going to call this what services are you interested in learning about? And now this is a little bit different. And so when we had the text input, it was a one-to-one relationship with a field. But for this multiple choice question, we're actually going to assign a data attribute for each option that we're going to provide. And so when I click to add an option, what you'll see is I can now set the field value. So in this case, I'm going to say yes. And I'm going to give this a label of banking. And I'm going to create another attribute again called banking. I'm just going to give this a value of 2 because we're only going to write probably a yes or no. And so now I can browse for an image, and I also have the ability to choose a hover or selected state. So I'll go ahead and add the check state image here. And so as you can see, this one has a check mark over it, and we'll look at how that actually works when we get in previewing this in a minute. So I've got an option there. So most of the attributes that, the inputs that you can set up, they all have the data attributes. They all function in the same way, where you're defining the label, the description, you have the option to make it required or not. And then with the hidden fields, it's a similar experience, but you don't have as much to do, because you're really just choosing an ID. You're choosing a field from your data extension. In this case, I'm choosing ID, and then you're providing the value. And so in this case, I'm going to use the personalization string for the subscriber key. You could also think about using, any other type of Marketing Cloud scripting here. So if you wanted to include an AMP script variable, you could do that as well. And I didn't mention this before, but in the inputs, you also have the ability to include AMP scripts. So we're not limiting you there. You could populate these labels or placeholder text, or even the option values if you wanted to. So now I've got some of the basic components here. This is looking pretty good. Let's jump over to one that has just a few more questions built out, so we can kind of look at the next step after you've defined the inputs. So I'm going to switch to the design tab. And the first thing that we'll see is the fallback. And so as I mentioned before, this is where you're defining the behavior for those people who open on an unsupported email client. And so in this case, what I've chosen is a block from Content Builder. And when I preview it here, it's that same block that we removed in the first instance. It links back to that same page that we had. And so we're very lucky in this case where, we had an existing experience that we could pull in. One of the things, if you're first getting into this, you don't have an existing landing page you can drag to, you're not sure how this is going to work, a good workaround is to use the view as a web page link. And so you can create a button that points to that, and then the messaging around that is, click here to do this. You can, if you want to call it out specifically that your email client doesn't support this interactive form, please click here to view the form. You can do something like that, and you can just click here to view the form. I will say that scenario works best when you're using a form that is the focus of the email and not a secondary kind of feature. Because if you think about having to scroll down when they click this button, they're taken to the full email on their web browser. They may have to scroll down again. It's just not the best experience. But of course, there's some other ways around that you could consider as well. But it's a great, for just testing it out, seeing if this works, getting some buy-in, show some initial results. It's a great opportunity to quickly produce something that you can get out. So that's the fallback. And then across the rest of these styles, you'll see, as I open up a couple of them here, we've surfaced many controls, and pretty much anything. There's actually a few we've identified that we're going to be adding in the future, just to make sure that you have the full set of controls. So for you email developers out there, any of the CSS attributes that you have, they are here. I know it's in the UI. I know that's not your favorite place to work with it, but the reason that we do this is because interactive email, building these and making sure that they render consistently across email clients isn't the easiest task. And so to make sure that we can do that consistently, we have to have a way that we can kind of control everything. So we want to give you the power to style it how you want, but we need to control the structure of the HTML and the CSS that we're adding to the email. So that's why at this point, you only have controls through the block. But I will say, if you get ambitious and want to dig into the HTML, inspect some of these elements, you will see the classes that we're using. You will see, the form structure, and you can certainly add your own custom styles to the head of the template that will then be applied. Obviously you'll have to work within the constraints to make sure that you're structuring that to target appropriately and we're not overriding what you're adding. But it's definitely possible. The only thing I would say is just please test and continue to test as you make changes. Because one of the great things about the setup that we have right now is we can react really quickly to changes in email client behavior, or even bugs that we identify in our setup. And so that each time you open this one block or drag in a new one, it's actually going to pull in the newest version of our code. So what can happen is if we make changes to ensure that this renders the same in Apple Mail, for instance, today, and you've added some custom CSS targeting on the elements, you may notice that it doesn't work anymore. And so that's the only kind of thing to watch out for if you do choose to add in custom styles that target the form. But otherwise, you can definitely go that route. And as you can see, just to illustrate, as you make changes, you'll see them update in the form. You have padding, margin controls. If I get into the inputs here, so I'll, for these images, you can control the width, height, the space between, which is also the same as margin, the label width, your hover and selected styles. You can also change the styles across theirs if you'd like. So there's a lot of granular control here, and if you expand all these accordions, it's quite a bit, and it's a little bit overwhelming. So having a plan is what you're going to style will help. But if you're familiar with any of these, it should be pretty easy to navigate. And if you're not, I would suggest just getting in there, clicking around, seeing what each of them does, because it's pretty easy to figure out just by clicking around. And so that's styling. That's the fallback state. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to actually switch. I'm going to share my full screen, and we're going to jump to. Oh, that'll work too. But we'll just do the main screen. Perfect. I want to jump in here into my mail client. So right now I'm in Apple Mail. I sent this email earlier today, and this is the form that we just built. So I'm testing it out. I want to see, does this work? So let's add in my name. Today I'm going to say saving and financial security, because that seems appropriate in these times. Events and webinars would be great to learn about, and maybe I want to know about investing. And so then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click submit, and we're going to be taken to that great cloud page that we built as that first step as well. And so there's my thank you message. And so this is super exciting, but it's also a little scary. So what happened? Is the data in my data extension? So let me jump into the records here. Let me make a little change just to refresh this. Let's see. And great. So I do have my first name, all of the stuff. There's subscriber key value, which I will call out. This is because of how I tested. The email that I built earlier has this. It was not a mistake. When you do this in an actual test, I forced this to happen just to kind of tie this back for our example. But this does get populated with the actual subscriber key if you use personalization strings or AMP scripts like I mentioned. But great, so it's here, it's in the data extension, and hopefully you can see that it's relatively easy to build these out. A few of the other things that I wanted to mention, actually I think that's good. So what I'd like to talk about now that we know about the data and kind of, we've seen how this all flows so that we have lots of time for questions, is just using that data. And so I'll switch to the next slide. How do you use the data? And there's a lot of ways that you can do this. Thinking about journeys and personalization, updating other clouds, all the things that we've talked about so far. But let's talk a little bit more specifically about these. So when you're thinking about customer preferences, and these obviously, the things in the next few slides, they don't have to be just one or the other. The data is in the data extension. You can put an action on it, like however you'd like. So thinking about personalization, we're doing this in email. So obviously, working and updating emails with this is a great place to start, but don't forget about your other channels as well. Mobile push, SMS, retargeting campaigns based on these, interests that you're collecting, for example. Web experiences, even print. This can go to fuel any of those. You can, depending on what you're collecting and what kind of data you're getting, you can push this a lot of places. Cloud pages. So, showing that data that you've captured on the cloud page, surfacing that to either confirm the submission, or we've seen scenarios where people are thinking about polling their subscribers, and then after that submit, they want to show the results so far. And so using a lookup back to that data extension, doing a little bit of math on it, you can populate the numbers, create a graph. Like there's a few different things that you could do there to really complete the circle for that, complete the cycle for that user, as well as start providing value on that data so that they can see that it's being used, that it makes sense, and they're happy that they've provided it, right? And of course, Journey Builder. So it's a great place where you can initiate journeys. You can use the data extensions to inform your decision splits. We'll also talk about engagement splits here in a few minutes. You can, build a custom activity to send this to other places. And when we're thinking about reviews and feedback, how can you action on this? So in the world of reviews, likely you have, maybe something that you've built internally, or you're partnering with a reviews provider like a Bazaar Voice or a Power Reviews, and they have different ways that you can get data to them about your reviews. Because if it's just sitting in the data extension, it's not helping anyone. And so one of the ways you could think about doing this is using the redirect on the cloud page. And so basically what happens is the submission comes in, the person would pass through the cloud page, the write to the data extension happens, and then they're immediately just redirected to another page where these values will exist in the URL as query parameters, and they can be parsed out there and used to pull into other systems. Similarly, you could post this data to an API of another service after. You could do that on the cloud page. You could do it through Journey Builder or a script activity. There's a number of ways that you can get this data out. Also thinking about reporting. So, internally for your own teams, for your own business, understanding, making sure that you're providing, updates on the effectiveness of these campaigns, total number of views, number of points, feedback, like new data points about your, subscribers, for instance, and then even using this in the case where you're collecting free text input to do sentiment analysis. Those are some really powerful tools that are becoming more available that can really, enhance your programs. And then you can do follow-ups based on these. So one of the things that we'll talk about in a minute is, if you're collecting a rating or if you're collecting a score, evaluating that score and sending different communications based on that. So when we get into Journey Builder, I've got a few screenshots here. Some people love Journey Builder, some people don't. Some people are intimidated by it. I've seen a variety of things over the past, year or so that I've been talking to more and more customers. But in this scenario that I've got on the screen right now, I've got my lead form. I come in, I'm waiting 2 days, and then based on whether there was the form submit, and this is the engagement split activity, if they submitted, then cool, we're going to update the opportunity in Sales Cloud. If they haven't, I want to trigger them a reminder email. And this is a pretty simplistic example, but it can show you the power here so that you can just make sure that you're optimizing your campaigns to continue to get to that endpoint where the real value is, and that's obtaining the data and using it in a meaningful way. And so just to dig into that engagement split a little bit, this is actually as of the May release, which is out to almost everyone at this point. When you go into the engagement split, into the interactive email, into a campaign with the interactive email form, what you'll now see is a link that goes to submit.mccontent.com and has a link alias of form submit, and you can use that, as the engagement split link. And so this will only be clicked, or only generate a click, I should say, when the submission actually is successful. So in the interactive email form block, you have the ability to set required fields, for example. If you have those required fields, someone doesn't complete it in the email and they make it to the cloud page, we're going to surface a little message that says, hey, you forgot this required field. It doesn't say that. It says required. It highlights the box. It's the standard browser behavior. But what that means is that people could have the opportunity to abandon at that point. So if they click from the email, they're missing a required field, and they don't submit, that doesn't generate the click that gets tied back to this. So in that case, they would still go down the lead form reminder path. They wouldn't go into the update opportunity activity. So just something to be mindful of, something to watch out for. And also, going forward in your campaign reporting, the click will show up in standard campaign reports. So you have an idea from, in that scenario, just by looking at your standard reporting, how many submissions have occurred. You can also use the form data in the decision split. So once it's in that data extension, let's take a look at the low score and the high score and provide, different routes. So if they have a low score, let's create a case and follow up with them. If they have a high score, let's just send them a thank you campaign. And this one gets a little more advanced, but if you're so inclined, you can develop a custom activity. So in this case, this is a screenshot of one that I built in the second half of last year. I just wanted to try it out to see what's possible. So I built a Node app. I hosted it on Heroku just to see what we could do. And what it really did, is I made this, it's just a pretty simple activity that takes a JSON payload. You can copy and paste it here. You can edit it within Journey Builder, and you can point this to a URL. So if you look closely, I have, webhook.site here. I was just testing it out to see what I could send and what I could ping to an external API relatively easily. Obviously, there's some more technical lift here, but it's a good option if this fits your use case, and it's a great way to get things out. In the resources that we'll share after, we'll link to a couple of things that kind of outline this and what you can do and how you can get started if this is interesting to you. And we also don't want to forget about Automation Studio. And so I will be honest, I actually haven't used Automation Studio as much as I would like to be able to say that I have at this point, but I know that you can do a lot of things with it. And so some of the things that come to mind are just, running on automations on this form data that in those data extensions to get it to other places. So similar to what we just talked about, it's just another way that, if automations if Automation Studio is where you like to work and where you live, then you can definitely do this as well, because you're just manipulating data just like you do with probably many other things across Marketing Cloud. And that's the real power and the value of the email form block, is let's get this data into a place where it's actionable, so that we can use it to inform our campaigns going forward, to better communicate, better build relationships with our customers. Now, I talked about this a few times before. So on the Cloud Pages block is the redirect option. And so when you're configuring this, I kind of showed you in the demo, but there's the redirect to a URL option. So you can put that to an external site. But one of the other interesting things to think about is you could drive this to another Cloud page. And so you can definitely work on the interactive email page with the data, and you can do some things there. But in some cases, you may not want to think about, the order of operations. So you might not want to think about when the submission has occurred, and you want to know for sure that it has. And so what you could do is you could redirect to another Cloud page. So when you choose this option, you'll actually put the rendered URL there, not like an AmpScript Cloud Pages URL function. You'll put the final URL that you get from the Cloud page. And then what will happen is we redirect after submission to that Cloud page, and we append all of the parameters, including that encrypted query string, the QS value that you're probably familiar with, that has a lot of the data about that person, the email that they came from, for example. And so that's available to that second Cloud page as well. And then you can use that to personalize the Cloud page. You can use that, to do a number of things, as well as you can look up back into the data extension where there's a write occurred, because that record will be there at that point. You could update Sales Cloud using the update single Salesforce object, the AmpScript function, for example, if you didn't want to go the Journey Builder route. So there's a lot of power here in just thinking about the tools that exist within Marketing Cloud and how you can use this to get that data where you need it to go. Okay, cool. So likely everything that I've talked about, you've either kind of heard, or especially in the Journey Builder Automation Studio world, you're familiar with. So I wanted to make sure that I gave you guys something else that you may not have heard, unless it's been widely talked about since our session this morning. But I will say that what I'm about to show you is a little bit, I don't want to say experimental. It definitely works. It's definitely a path forward, but it does introduce some complexity and some opportunity where you could break things. So just please test it. Please, make sure that if you're going to rely on this, if it's going to be a set it and forget it campaign, you go back and check it from time to time to make sure that nothing has changed. But what I talked about was with the interactive email Cloud page, in this screenshot, you can see I've got the thank you for your submission as my success content in the form block. And then what I've done is I've dragged in a HTML block above and below the form block. And so this could be in the same row, it could be in the two sections that we provide. But this is kind of key to these next couple of things that I'm going to show you. And the reason for that is the form block, when you interact with it, when you set your success content, we're adding code to the page. In addition to defining either a redirect URL or the success message, we're adding other things as well. But what this allows you to do is something like this. You could check to see if this person has already submitted. So instead of using an upsert or adding an additional row, what if you want to say, I only want one submission, the first one, that's the only chance that they get. You could add these code snippets, not these exactly, please. These are just placeholders to show you kind of what's possible. This will not work if you put these in directly, but before and after that form block on the interactive email Cloud page. And so what this essentially says is, let's do something in that top HTML block that I've drug in to evaluate this response coming in. So let's look up the subscriber in this data extension and see if they've submitted, for example. If they have, then let's skip the form block content and go to the bottom form block and do something else. So show them a message that says, sorry, you've already submitted, or thank you, but we have your submission for earlier. If you'd like to do this, try again later. Like, whatever the case may be. So what our if statement here says is, if it doesn't have the record, let's let the form block proceed, write the submission to the data extension. But if it does, let's show them this other content, not let the form block code execute and stop the submission. And so that's one thing that you could kind of consider. And another thing is setting a form expiration date. So if you wanted to only collect responses during a certain period of time, you could do something similar where you're checking the current date and time against the predefined date and time. And then either showing or skipping the form based on that. And so this allows you, obviously if you have a limited time promotion or something where you only want it to be valid for a certain time, there's a few examples I can think about this where you're collecting a sweepstakes entry, for instance, or something along those lines. This would allow you to kind of control that experience a little bit more instead of someone, opening this email later, clicking submit, thinking that they've still gotten in and that they're going to be considered when in fact, like the time passed and, they've opened this email 3 months ago and from 3 months ago, and there's no chance that this would happen. We've already announced a winner, those kind of situations. So that's a few things to at least get you guys thinking about. We've got about 15 minutes left for questions. And so I think that's good. Manisha, could you let me know if we have any questions and I can try to answer them or ramble on about something else?
Yeah, we got some questions and I answered most of them in the chat. Some I'll bring up because I think they could definitely use a little bit more airtime. But
Sure.
If anyone has questions, please feel free to continue to chat them in and we'll take a couple of more. Matt, let's start with talking about AmpScript. Can you talk about ways that someone can use AmpScript with interactive email?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I started touching on a little bit and then I got sidetracked, I think. So I want to jump back in here. Let's use this form, for example. So really within the inputs, you have the full ability to personalize these using AmpScript or GTL, for example, if you'd like to, as you see fit. So right now, I've hard-coded first name. If you wanted to consider doing localizations using AmpScript, you could populate these that way. One of the things I will say is you can use AmpScript in any of these fields that you can type in. It will render correctly. Where it gets a little bit tricky, and this is something that we're thinking about how to best accomplish, but when I have a required field, one of the things that happens in here, I can actually show you guys. So if I take out my first name here, I'm going to click submit now. We're going to go back to this cloud page, but because that first name is missing, there's my required indication, right? And so I've now stopped on the cloud page at this validation point. It's carried through my additional selections, but that one's missing. And so the only little, asterisk, and maybe it's not little depending on, who you are, what your actual use case is that if you've used AmpScript, for instance, in this first name field, at this step, we're actually not re-rendering or re-evaluating that AmpScript. So you would see the AmpScript value here just because of the way that we've set this up so that we can pass as much detail as possible to the cloud page. So that's one consideration. One workaround for that is to create a localized version of the form. And so you build a form for each language. And then what you can do is you can use if statements, in the AmpScript in the template to hide or show that content based on the language. And then what will happen is because you're sending them that localized form that's complete, if they hit those validation errors, they're going to see the localized content on the cloud page. And just to elaborate a little bit more on that, when you may think that you could drag in a content block here or add this in my, update this to have that an AmpScript if statement right here at the end of this. That actually won't work and you'll get an error in the end. But you can add it to the template, and I should have thought about this and created one, but you can add it to the template code. And in the template that you're using, really what you do is you open up that if statement, then you put in your slot for your content block, then you close it or do your else if statement and then put in your next content block. And because that's in at the template level, that will be evaluated correctly and populate that content as you would expect, essentially. The other thing along those lines is, that allows you to provide a full form where you're like changing that based on someone's preferences or language or whatever the case may be. One of the things we often get asked is, can I do that with the individual questions? And at this point, you can't. We are, there are some constraints around how this is, how this has to be rendered. They're preventing that for us right now. It's definitely something that's on our radar that we're thinking about. But right now, again, the solution to that is if you want different versions or different questions within different forms, is to build an individual form and then populate those, either within one template using some Amscript if statements, or segmenting your audiences appropriately and sending them different campaigns.
Great. Thanks, Matt. In a typical survey, I've seen things like where if I answer yes to a question, the next question would be, one thing, and if I answer no, then their logic would give me a different resulting question. Is that possible in interactive email?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's not currently a straightforward path for that in the block. What you see are the fields that are available, and the reason for that is we can't easily do them, like it's kind of like a branching logic within an email. So most email clients don't support that. There are a few that do, where you can dynamically change the content of the email based on those selections. And so what we're thinking about are different ways to tackle this, but it's definitely something that we're interested in, and we know that there's a lot of great use cases where we can leverage that. One of the ways that you could think about doing this now is, kind of on that cloud page to cloud page scenario, where if you wanted to set up, subsequent steps, so put your core questions that really you want to make sure are answered in as a first step in the email. So you get those, and then as you capture that submission and you're, moving them to either, the cloud page or a different page, you can use the data that passed through those URL parameters to inform those next questions that you might display on the web experience, essentially, where you have full flexibility. And that's something that, if you're not aware, in email, we are limited to HTML and CSS only, and so that's where some of these limitations come around. And even within that, the reason that we only have interactivity in some email clients, and it's at varying degrees, is because they don't all support the same set of HTML and CSS elements that we use to build these. And so that's what really limits us right now. We're actively monitoring all the email clients that we can to make sure that, if someone changes their rendering, that we can take advantage of it. So if any of you have people who have influence at, say, an Outlook or some other big ESPs that don't support interactivity currently, feel free to mention how cool this is, how much you would love to see it, and put them in touch with me, and we can talk about the requirements they need. But that's one of the things I'd say. It's definitely something we're considering, because branching logic is something that is a pretty powerful tool, and being able to action on those kind of different responses is something that's important. Manisha, what else we got?
Better audio. Hey.
Hey.
Now I can hear you again. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened. Can you talk about what reporting is available for interactive email?
Sure. That's a great question. So you will have your standard open and click reporting across everything else that you've included in your email. For the interactive email form block in particular, you will get essentially a click generated for each submission that occurs. And so you'll see that alongside your standard reports. There'll be a form submit. That's the actual link alias that we use that will be included when those submissions happen. And secondary to that, because this data ends up in a data extension, depending on how you structure it, if you'd like, a single form pointing to a single data extension, you can then use the number of records in there, for instance, as a good proxy for the reporting around this. But really, it doesn't change any of the other standard metrics that you're used to. It doesn't change what's reported in any of the other standard metrics that you're used to. It may have an impact, as I mentioned before, on click rates, for example, but otherwise, the standard email KPIs that you're familiar with are still available, and then we're just layering on the submissions as a click.
Great. Matt, can you talk a little bit about the fallback experience, how, if I'm opening this email in Outlook, how that would work, but also if there are workarounds if I don't already have a form hosted on web that I can drive people to?
Sure, and actually I was just thinking about that, because we may get lucky. So if I go to outlook.com right now, and this is the account that I've been using to test with, I think, and I look at the email that we sent, that I tested from my Apple Mail account earlier, what you'll see is the form won't show up here. So when I receive this email, what I'm going to have is the update your preferences button that we've selected on the design tab in the fallback experience. And so for any email clients that don't support these, and I don't think I was very explicit about this before, but the big ones that will support interactivity are Gmail, Apple, Yahoo, AOL. There are some others that support the interactive email forms, but those are the main ones. There is, just so you guys aren't surprised, there are some slight rendering differences with Gmail compared to everything else. So if we look at this form right now, in Gmail, they add a radio button or a checkbox, depending on whether you've done single or multi-select, to any of the button or the image elements. Everything else is essentially the same, and you won't really notice a difference, but that does stand out. And most people notice that and question it. So that's one thing to be aware of. And so when I look at, this fallback experience, I may have set this up using the view as a web page URL. I was thinking about this. I don't think I did. Okay. So what essentially happens is you can define this button, and I could probably go back and change it, but you can define this to point to the view as a web page, which is the same as this view online link. And then what people can have is, they have the opportunity, this opens in their browser and they can see the form. And especially in this scenario where the form is the focus of the email, it's really easy for them to complete this. It still writes to the same cloud page. It's a great way to utilize this without, getting into building out another form experience if you don't have that today.
Thank you. Here's a question I haven't heard before, but I'm curious if you know the answer. I don't. Are we able to integrate fingerprinting to send in reviews for syndication, let's say to a Bazaar Voice, to syndication to the retailers?
That's a great question. And I'm not sure I've heard this referred to in this way, but I think what it might be getting at is really including, basically a unique identifier for that record so that you know that this is a verified purchase. And that's definitely, there are a few ways to tackle that, and a few ways that we've seen customers do in the past as when we were a standalone company. So if there's a unique identifier that can be reused across the reviews that are submitted, you can include that as a hidden field. You can include that in the data that you're using to send to, and then pass that through. So that the Bazaar Voice looks at it and they know that it's authenticated, they know that it's coming from you essentially, or it could be a combination of variables. In these scenarios, I've only included one hidden field right now, but there's no limit really to what you can include here. So you could include order ID, product ID, customer identifier, unique hashed email address. You could include a number of different fields and data points that would allow you to securely map this back to that individual user and that individual record. So if I'm understanding the question correctly, I think the answer is yes. There's definitely ways that you can do that.
Great, thank you. Are there any plans to integrate interactive email forms with Journey Builder so that it could be used as an entry source the same way that Cloud Pages are with Smart Capture?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as you guys are probably aware, if you use the data extension entry point in Journey Builder, it's at most hourly. And so there could be situations where someone submits, they miss that, and they're waiting at least an hour until they get that follow-up or that's pushed to Sales Cloud or Service Cloud to kick off that case. So this is one of the things that we're evaluating to figure out the best way that we can do this. But it is definitely on our radar, something we're thinking about.
Okay, great. We're coming up against the hour, so I have one more question. And if anyone's got anything, last thoughts or questions they want to chat in, please go ahead and do so. But Matt, how have we found interactive email? Have our clients found success with it? Has it been impactful for their programs?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so we're working on some official customer stories that we'll share out, and you guys will obviously see that once we have those. But what we saw is a standalone company, and from our pilot, what we saw is their submission rates for people who are trying out interactive forms were surpassing their click rates. So if you think about a standard email campaign where maybe they were getting, let's just say, a 2% click rate, which is good for click rates in most cases. Some industries are higher, some industries are lower. They were seeing maybe twice that even in some scenarios. So you can think about kind of the impact that would have. People, they're not clicking in the emails, but they are definitely taking the steps to take that action to drive to that next step. And in terms of reviews or just data points captured, we saw many fold increases in the number of data points by some of those customers. So keep an eye out. The one thing I will say is, while we have seen pretty much universal success, it's a very blanket, broad statement, I know, but it kind of depends on your success criteria, right? So for some of our customers, that means a better user experience. For some of them, that means tripling the number of reviews that they've provided. Like, whatever that is for you, you have to figure out and test into that to see, does this make sense? I mean, thankfully, the level of effort to test and into this is, maybe you have to create a new template and content builder. Maybe you only use HTML paste. Oh, which reminds me, we'll have a session next month, watch Trailhead Live, to talk about how you can do that if you are a straight HTML paste user, how you can best go about creating a template. But so even with those kind of barriers, the value that you get from that reduced friction to collect this data usually is definitely worth it. And so testing this out in a few campaigns to understand what kind of impact this could have, and then continuing to optimize that, you can definitely see really big increases in the number of submissions that you can obtain.
Amazing. Yeah, watch out for some customer stories from our pilot, and I'll hand it back to Jenna or Gilda to close us out.
All right. Thank you very much, Manisha and Matt, for this extremely informative session. I can't wait to see all the new exciting forms come out of this interactive emails that are going to be created from this. Thank you to all the attendees for tuning in to this webinar today. A recording of this presentation will be distributed tomorrow. Please join us next Tuesday for Lookup Answers, where Greg Gifford and Jacob Edwards will be discussing SSJS with Karina Cohen. And special shout out to Gilda Halil for coordinating these meetups for the users around the world. Thank you, Gilda. Have a good night, everyone.
Night, everyone.